Greetings collectors and welcome to today's retro game review. It's part 3 of this Gauntlet mini-series. Welcome to the Gauntlet. So far we've been traversing the classic era of Gauntlet games, having looked at the original Gauntlet for the 8-bit generation and Gauntlet 2 for the Commodore Amiga. If you missed parts 1 and 2, I highly recommend watching those first before continuing on the quest today. Now, on with the quest and Gauntlet The Third Encounter. With the first and second instalments resulting in groundbreaking smash hits for Atari, it was only natural that they wanted to leverage Gauntlet's popularity and draw attention to their own hardware. Roll on 1990 and enter the Atari Lynx. Now, this handheld was meant to compete primarily with the Sega Game Gear with its full colour graphics. The Third Encounter came on a small cartridge and slots nicely into the system. Being a bit of an Atari addict, I am a proud owner of an Atari Lynx, a much underrated handheld console in my opinion. It had a few games and a short life cycle, but it did have its moments. They are now more of a curiosity piece than anything else, but they are definitely worth a second look for the curious hardware collector. Here's a few specs for you. The main CPU is a dual 16-bit custom CMOS. It has 64 kilobytes of DRAM, supports 4096 colours, a diagonal screen size of 3.5 inches, 8-bit sound, and a rather power-guzzling 4 hours of gameplay with 6 AA batteries. Some small upgrades were made in the Atari Lynx 2. You could have 5 hours gameplay rather than 4, and stereo sound rather than mono. Overall though, the two consoles are very similar. I do remember thinking some years ago that a game like Gauntlet just wouldn't work on the Atari Lynx. Small sprites on a small handheld, it doesn't naturally seem logical. Arcade experience to handheld, 4 players to 1, if ever there was a mismatch in goals, this was it. However, I was wrong. Not completely wrong, but I wasn't completely disappointed by this title. The Third Encounter is actually a solid entry in the series for what it tries to be, but you will have to imagine that parts 1 and 2 never happened. With graphics only on par with the 8-bit originals, this third instalment delivers some traditional Gauntlet fun, but at a horrible cost in presentation. Even though it really doesn't need it, there is a backstory in the way of the return of the Star Gem. That's really about as far as the developers could muster in terms of a plot, because quite frankly, it's Gauntlet, and we already know the score here. So, let's boot this one up. Well, I think technology has beaten us today. My Atari Lynx is now pushing 3 decades old, and even at the best of times, the contrast isn't that great, so I think you might have to excuse me if I emulate this one today. I can actually see and play the game fine here in my own living room, but if you're a viewer online, I'm guessing that this experience isn't going to be that fun unless I use emulation. Ah, much better. So, first off, there is a real upset in the hero lineup. This time around, there's an android, Valkyrie, gunfighter, nerd, pirate, punk rocker, samurai, and wizard. So, wow, what's going on here? This is now a universe where wizards sit happily alongside cowboys and nerds. Who, incidentally, is most definitely Chip from Chip's Challenge. We see what you did there, Atari. For purist Gauntlet fans, this may be a bit at odds from the traditional formula, but I'll let it slide, because pirates are cool. As with previous entries in the series, each hero class has various stat points of speed, strength, and also missiles this time around. Interestingly, I've seen several internet conspiracy theories that the android here is actually the basis for the Android platform logo. I do see where they're coming from, but personally I just don't buy it. There's only so many ways you can draw a mechanical bin with legs and arms. So, how does it play? Now, I know you're looking at this one on a modern HD screen. Remember the original Atari Lynx was only 160 by 102 pixel resolution. I'll simulate this one on a full 1920 pixel display here. So yeah, 1990s hardware, we love you, but things have changed. In terms of animation, there's not a lot going on here. The cowboys walking, for example, only has 2 frames of animation, something beaten by the 1985 software releases. The goals remain very similar to traditional Gauntlet: collect keys, treasure, and health. There's some nice twists in here though. You can exchange gold at computer terminals for upgrades. The level design is rather competent and works well for this platform. That limitation in pixels is overcome by a radar system, allowing you to see ahead of you in first person, which is a really neat little feature. And you'll need this for a very good reason. See here, grey keys are on a grey stone floor. Why oh why could we not have had gold keys like every other game in the series? A mystery to this day. You can hold down the button to scroll through your inventory to use and place items, which is a new feature for Gauntlet, but I found it a little distracting as I wanted to be running around killing ghosts rather than managing inventory. Oh yes, the inventory. You now have restricted inventory slots so you can pick up keys and gold, but hit your limit and you can no longer pick up any more, meaning that you often have to drop gold to pick up the keys that you will 100% need to complete the level. Again, I don't have an issue with this mechanic in gaming. However, this is Gauntlet, which is supposed to be about the hack and slash dungeon crawling. Imagine in the arcade if you had to manage inventory in this way. It just puts a different feel to the game. The physical presentation of the third encounter is worth talking about briefly. Notice how we have the Tengen artwork from the original Gauntlet back. As much as I really like the image, why is it back? For starters, we no longer have the elf or warrior class included in the game. Secondly, it makes me feel that Atari were cashing in on the series name rather than a genuine attempt to create a new experience for fans. There's just something a little off about this entry in the series. It's not bad, but it's not great either. I wonder, was this even meant to be a Gauntlet game in the first place? Sadly, it's one of the entries in the series that not too many gamers have played. Unless you have an interest in handheld gaming from the early 90s, it's a title that's likely to have gone unnoticed. The original Dungeons & Dragons roots seem to have been a bit abandoned here, and I can't help thinking that Atari just reskinned a version of Chip's Challenge and rebranded it as a Gauntlet game. Technically speaking, you can play the third encounter as a 4-player event, if you have 3 friends that have Atari Lynxes and link-up cables. But to be honest, if you did have 3 other friends with Atari Lynxes and link-up cables, there is at least one of them that would be choosing the nerd, and not in an ironic way. Now, don't get me wrong, I was a fan of Atari back in the 80s and the 90s, but it was around this point that myself and others started to feel a bit disenfranchised. This third outing of Gauntlet on Atari's own hardware should have been a showstopper. It should have been as Mario 64 was to the N64 or Shenmue to the Dreamcast, but it wasn't. When you look back at Shadow of the Beast on the Atari Lynx, you realise how great games could look on the platform. I just wish that Atari would have held back the third encounter until it was fully ready. For all its lack of ambition, I do like the fact that Atari kept this title to themselves and made it a Lynx exclusive. It's a game that you can point to and say, look, Atari really did try to deliver decent hardware, but sometimes just lacked the software. It may not have been the most talked about entry in the series, but it's one that I would happily recommend to retro gamers curious about Atari's history. As the fans know, Gauntlet's fate was undoubtedly intertwined with Atari's own history. The Atari 2600 dominance was now long gone. The Lynx, although a decent piece of hardware, struggled from day one in terms of third-party support and sales. Financially, the future looked bleak around this time, and Atari's rivals Sega and Nintendo would go on to run rampant over them in the 16-bit era. However, Atari and Tengen weren't dead yet, and many did still regard them as a decent software house. Of course, Gauntlet The Third Encounter was only the third encounter for Atari fans. For everyone else that didn't own a Lynx, the next entry in the series couldn't really be marketed as Gauntlet 4, seeing as this third encounter was brief and elusive to say the least. Instead, Atari hit the renaming button and allowed US Gold and Tengen to handle the launch of the third major release title in the series, Gauntlet 3 The Final Quest. So far, 3 games down, 3 different experiences. We thought that we knew what was coming in Gauntlet 3. Little did we know that the Gauntlet series was about to take a dark turn. A very dark and disturbing turn that would break the Gauntlet formula to pieces. As the box says, the final quest, the gates of hell are open, and oh my, they weren't kidding. Join me in the next episode as I help shed light on this most reviled game in the series, Gauntlet 3. The quest continues.